everybody? Jeff Katz back with you. Going to take you now through week 2 of the Underground. The sort of teen, tween, CW angsty corner of the WRP universe. We get a little previously on Arrested Development intro here as we look back at last week. And last week was really about sort of setting up the world of the Underground, introducing the PW3 Liz and Stone dynamic, and setting up King as well, because they're really going to be the legs that hold aloft the table of the Underground season, as we see our Crazy Joe Davola-inspired, vaguely Fast and Furious-esque intro for the Underground here. And so we're going to meet right up front here, Luther and Shayna. Shayna, a little bit of a nod to Sherry Martel, who I worked with in WCW and absolutely adored. I think I mentioned on the Squared Circle Reddit recently that there were maybe like 2 nights there where I thought for a second Sherry might take me upstairs and make a real man out of me. And I would have done that just for the story. But Sherry was a badass, incredibly talented, and always really cool to me as a young man in WCW. So it's not an accident that you have Liz as a nod to Elizabeth and Shayna as a nod to Sherry here. And we're now going to see Nick Jackson as Stone, who's going to be sort of your lead babyface through the run of this series. And I have to say, obviously, as I mentioned before, from the beginning, the Young Bucks were always going to be the guys I wanted to build this around. They were key to doing this. They were the first guys I went after once this officially started moving. And when it came time to figure out that main storyline, and I knew, again, it's very CWWE inspired. You cannot get much more of that, subgenre or milieu, if you will, than the sort of Dawson and Pacey and Katie Holmes or whoever in the middle. I forgot what her name was on the show. I was more of a Jen guy myself. Michelle Williams. Michelle Williams, very good in the original Species as well as a young Natasha Henstridge. Underrated movie Species. And so now here we're going to see Famous B as Luther. Famous B was working, I think, mostly like San Diego, some LA indies. I think maybe some of the Santino Brothers stuff. I might be wrong about that. But a great guy, really easy to deal with. And now here we go. Nick Jackson going to debut as Stone. And as I mentioned on the prior episode, the idea here was to really avoid, in WRP, which as I mentioned is sort of the HBO or FX corner of the universe, those are very heightened characters. They're pretty mature characters. They're relatively dark. In this case, the idea was to kind of go heightened teenage. So maybe it's a teenage nickname. Maybe there's a slight gimmick quality, but not excessively pushed. And it was very intentional in this case. And so as I mentioned earlier, when you look at Nick and Matt Jackson both, incredibly talented, great guys to work with. I am not remotely surprised to see them doing what they're doing and seeing them be successful doing it. But when I got these 2 guys in, Matt to me is the more natural heel. Even removing the fact you have one is the more fair-haired, one's the darker-haired, and that's, you got a little white hat, black hat, symbolic sort of stuff there at a almost basic psychological level. A beautiful leg lariat there by Famous B as Luther. Not to be confused with Dr. Luther, because in our universe that is, of course, Father Dante, leader of the Ministry of Prosperity. And as mentioned, this is all taking place in the same universe. You're going to see MVP's Lord of War and Joey Ryan's Chase Walker eventually showing up here. You'll see Rick Knox, of course, as Rick Knox, the same official from WRP. I have to say, I listen to Jim Cornette's YouTube and stuff, and they take shots at Knoxy all the time. I loved Rick. Rick worked for me multiple times, was fantastic, great guy, game for anything, and I never thought twice about any of his in-ring work because he never gave us a reason to. So while I have not seen any of the AEW stuff that Cornette is pissing and moaning about, I don't quite get it based on my own experience because I loved Knox. I still love him. Great dude. I'd work with him again in 2 seconds flat. Now, you see the beautiful athleticism of Nick Jackson, Famous B. They're up to meet him, add a little impact to that high cross body. And now here we go. Last week we saw Stone watching PW3 in action. Now you've got PW3 and Liz, and we established going in that there's backstory already prior going into this season between this trio. And a lot of the assumption is you're smart enough as an audience to understand that I don't need to tell you every beat of what went on because you know these archetypes and you've seen whether it's Dawson's Creek or One Tree Hill or 90210 or every generation has their own version of this show. Hell, Saved by the Bell. Because it's not like Zach and Slater didn't have love triangle stuff. People get this shorthand, and so I'm a big believer. I think it was Larry Kasdan. The idea of sort of show don't tell sometimes is what you got to do, and I think this was an opportunity to show instead of tell. The audience doesn't need to be led from A to B to C through every element. They get right away that there's history here. She's in the middle of it, etc. And in the case of Luther and Shayna, a bit more of a subtle, longer-term build, as you're going to see the Luther-Shayna dynamic sort of evolve and change over the run of this. And again,
Irish Whip in reversed.
These are not, the adult-oriented, darker storylines of WRP. These are all very clearly aiming for more of a teen sort of bent. And I'm going to keep hitting that CW thing, particularly because Awesomeness itself, when Google did this deal via YouTube, they hired about maybe 15 to 20 companies to do these branded verticals, and Awesomeness was one of the first, or one of the few that survived and were successful. And the whole thinking behind Google and YouTube bringing them in was that Brian and his team had a really successful run doing, One Tree Hill had a very long run on I think it even started on WB and went into CW, if I'm not mistaken. So they had a knack for hitting this audience, and that's been borne out by the fact that Awesomeness still exists, and it's been sold 3 or 4 times, but hey, what can you do? That's the business. And we see a beautiful, almost Dustin Rhodes-esque bulldog out of the natural Dustin Rhodes style bulldog out of the corner there.
It's over.
And so Stone, basically the prodigal son, returning. His storyline forwarded with PW3, and as you can see, a little discontent by Shayna there. Not very happy about Luther picking up the L against Stone in that match. And I think, foreshadowing, that might come back eventually to have ramifications later here in the Underground season. I will say one of the other things, looking back at this for the first time in a while, is the benefit of having such a big crew, the ability of having the Awesomeness machine behind you, infinitely less stressful from a production point of view, just by virtue of the fact you're not having to do so much multitasking from a sort of producing and directing creative point of view. In this case, I have to say it was much more of a even more so of a film production approach, because you had literally an in-house crew to be able to port over to do this in a way you couldn't do necessarily on WRP, just by virtue of the scale and budget. And so here we go now. A nice ovation for Luther and Shayna as they head out into the tetanus-filled darkness. That was not a very clear, that warehouse, very sketchy.
Let's take a look at our competitors for the big match next week in the Underground.
We're going to go back into the feed here. Our quick hit interview segment. There's Ryan Kidd again at 1600. We talked last episode about the fact that the bastards changed the SAT on me while we were doing this. And technically he should be 2400 or whatever, but I'm going with the classic. You could consider it a Pennsylvania Avenue or a Murder at 1600 reference, if you will. One of the great trailers of all time, in which Wesley Snipes comes out and says, "There's been a murder at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, an address that changes all the rules." You don't get trailer lines like that anymore, so shout out to you, Dr. Wesley T. Snipes, artist.
Next week.
And now Brandon Howard, USC student here, channeling his emo side as Dread. And again, that's about as heightened, Dread and like Steve Jobs, he's about as heightened as you're going to get gimmick and nickname-wise at this point. Very intentionally so, and of course we're going to see these guys ultimately debut here in the next couple episodes to come, and I will be here to guide you through it as we do so. So it's been a pleasure. We'll talk to you all soon here at WRP Central.